It's the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. Thank you for joining us. We're talking owls at the moment, and there's an owl that I grew up wishing I would be able to see one, because they only lived in the deepest, darkest forests, and they were a bird of folklore, fable, mystery. Did they actually still exist? Who wondered? Because someone like me, a young birder, had never, ever seen one. But now they're in our suburbs, and people like my guest are studying them and unlocking their secrets. Dr. Bronwyn Isaac, hello. How are you? Thank you for joining me. Let's go. Owls.
Thank you for inviting me to come along and talk about one of the subjects that I'm super passionate about. A little bit about me. I did undergrad in conservation ecology. I was then looking around for an animal project to do because I've always loved animals, and I ended up picking powerful owls. I'd never seen one up to that point, but I saw my first one and I kind of fell in love. I then did my PhD on powerful owls, and my PhD really looked at the thing that I'm quite passionate about is that how animals change over space and time, and what sort of resources they actually need to live in the environments that they do.
Now, you have something in common with powerful owls then, and I'm sure it's been pointed out to you before, that you both love small furry animals.
I love all animals. I always feel a little bit guilty saying that the powerful owl is my favourite animal, because here in Australia we're so blessed. We've got so many awesome animals that are found nowhere else in the world, and we've got a lot of conservation issues. But I think we're starting to tackle those issues as well. But we are here to talk about owls. So the powerful owl is actually our largest owl species here in Australia. Its scientific name is Ninox strenua. And basically what Ninox means is it's got a face more like a hawk. So we've got like sort of two streams of owls here in Australia. We've got the Tytos, those beautiful heart-shaped sort of flattish faces. And then we have the Ninox, which have the hawk faces.
So how did you get drawn into studying owls? Let's talk about that progression in your study. As now, let me get it right. You're a spatial biologist. Is that the right terminology? Actually, let's define that before we go into owls. What makes a spatial biologist different to a biologist?
I think as scientists, we always like to give ourselves fancy names. So I was actually thinking about it this morning when I was walking the dog. I was thinking, if I'm asked to describe who I am, there's actually three parts to me. So the first one is that I'm a scientist. So what really fascinates me is what we call spatial ecology, which is, in a nutshell, how animal distributions change over time. So, over months, over years, over decades, and also through space. So, particularly the powerful owl, as Grant mentioned, right at the start, we thought they were only forest species. But, in the last 25 years, we've actually realized that they do inhabit those sort of urban fringe environments. So places like Warrandyte, which have some urbanization, but also some quite natural environments, all the way through to sort of those really, really urbanized environments that we find in cities.
Now, that makes me wonder. When I was a kid, sometimes cats would just mysteriously go missing. Now, powerful owls are big. They're big birds. Do we know? Do they, as well as possums, and a cat is approximately the same size as a big beefy brush-tailed possum? Are powerful owls known to eat cats?
So I'll just give you some size estimates here, just so the audience understands, exactly how big the owl is that we're talking about. So we're talking about an owl that's 65 centimeters from the tip of their head to the tip of their tail. So because often we're visual people and we need to understand how big that is, think 2 standard rulers plus a little bit more added on. So these birds have quite a large wingspan of around 1.35 meters, and the weight is sort of up to 1,700 grams, although there have been instances where they exceed that weight. And as you mentioned, they primarily do eat possums and gliders. So, we've got really big gliders out in the forest. You've got your greater gliders. You've also got big brush-tailed possums, and that's sort of their primary food. However, they do eat a whole heap of other stuff as well. So they eat things like birds, so cockatoos, all of that sort of stuff. But one of the most common questions, which is what you've asked me, that I constantly get when I go out and give community talks is, will they eat cats? And the question is, as far as I know, the answer is, as far as I know, they've never actually shown up in the pellets, which is the regurgitated bits. However, if a cat is climbing up a tree, because they primarily eat arboreal animals, so up the trees, basically they'd be fair game. So that's another reason to keep your cats inside.
Or another reason not to keep your cat in a roofed enclosure. So depending on your stance on urban cats. Bronwyn, can I ask, how do they hunt? Do we know how they hunt? I think many of us might have seen barn owls at work and on TV where they're flying along and they'll often just drop down on a mouse in some grass or in some open scrub. How do powerful owls hunt?
Well, the 2 words I'd like to give you is silent and deadly. And apparently it's really rare to actually see powerful owls capture prey. But one night I was actually out in an urban area, and I was radio tracking my male back before we had reliable GPS trackers. And I followed him out into the suburbs because I was wondering what he was doing so far out of the parkland. And when I actually got out there, I saw him sitting in a tree, and he was kind of eyeing something that was moving along a branch in another tree. And all of a sudden, almost faster than what my eyes could actually follow, he had taken off and he had captured this owl. He'd captured the possum, and then he actually sat there and proceeded to eat the possum. So it's a very humane, very quick process. They simply clasp onto sort of the head with one of their lots of talons and the body with the other, and they snap its neck. So hopefully that's not too graphic for some of your viewers.
Well, I think anyone who's interested in owls know that they're not sweet and cuddly, even though they're often portrayed, especially snowy owls are always portrayed as wise and a bit cute and cuddly. But owls are hunters, and I always thought, I like to think that they might hunt similar to the way the goshawks hunt, compared to how the eagles and the kites generally hunt. So sounds a little bit like they're an ambush predator as much as anything else.
Yeah, they very much ambush their prey. The possum did not even hear or see the owl coming, and it was over very, very quickly.
Now, before we talk about the things that an owl needs to be successful in an urban environment, you mentioned that you now have accurate trackers and that you were earlier using radio trackers. Can you tell us a little bit about how over time you have monitored owl populations or individual owls in a population, the methodology that that you undertake in that kind of study? Because I don't think that people really know what's required and what's changed. So, yeah, the floor is yours. Talk about how you study a secretive big nighttime predator.
No problems. I think it depends on what you actually want to know, but because we wanted to know a little bit about, where these owls were going, how much space they were using, a very small part of my initial project was actually about that information. So I only radio tracked a couple of owls, and basically what radio tracking is that a tracker gets placed on the back of the owl itself. So we catch the owl, we put the tracker on, and then we re-release the owl. We also do health checks. So, we wait around for a while to make sure the owl is acting normally. We go back the next morning and we check the owl just to make sure everything's going all right. With radio trackers, one of the downfalls about radio trackers is that they're very labor intensive. So what that actually means is for me to get any data out of a radio tracker, I actually have to go out and I have to take 3 different readings quite quickly to then be able to triangulate those readings to know exactly where the owl's sitting. So basically, I'd go out at night, I would take one reading, I'd go back to the car, have a bit of a nap, I'd then go out and I'd do another lot of 3 readings and do that for, say, 5 or 6 hours across the night and into sort of the morning. GPS trackers are a lot better because basically what it means is we still catch the owl, we put the tracker on them. However, then the owl just proceeds to do its thing, and that GPS tracker will actually record the locations everywhere that owl moves. And basically, once every couple of days, we go out with a remote download machine, and it basically downloads all the data to it. The other beneficial thing about this is that we don't have to follow the owl around at night, which means that there's less of a chance that we're actually influencing its movements and that we're getting true readings of its proper behaviour.
That's a really important part of study, isn't it? That you don't want to, one, stress the owl because that is a detrimental effect, but obviously if the owl knows that you are hot on its heels with a TV antenna or something following it around, it's obviously, well, we assume it's obviously not going to act in a normal, natural way. It's actually, perhaps it's only trying to lead you away from a brood or a nest site. So how do you attach the modern GPS tracker? Is it a harness or is there an implant, or what does it look like? How long does it last? And of course, I'm always interested in how much that equipment costs. Like, what kind of a percentage of an annual research grant would that be?
I actually can't help you with the costs. I was never the one to actually buy the trackers myself. I've always been part of a team. But basically, we have quite a small sort of square GPS tracker with a longish antenna. When I first started, when I was radio tracking, we were actually using a harness. Like you said, much like just a backpack that people put on, and the tracker would sit behind the owl, sort of, under where the wings move, so that we weren't influencing its flight. There are advantages and disadvantages to that method of attaching transmitters. However, we've actually moved on from there. So when I was helping the honours students and PH students that came after me, basically we'd moved on to GPS trackers, and those trackers are actually now tail mounted, which meant that they basically either stay on as long as they can and then they fall off, or we capture the owl back and we remove that tracker, Or option 3, they molt their feathers, their tail feathers at regular intervals, and it will just come off with the tail feathers. So, we've learned a lot about catching owls since we first started. Our success rate when I first started wasn't that great, but we've learned all the tricks and techniques to actually get the owls coming quickly and capture the owl as well. So we've learned a lot as we've progressed through.
So the modern tracker is what, the size of a 20-cent piece or smaller, and super glued onto a tail feather on the owl.
We actually find the two middle tail feathers, and it's actually then attached with super glue. It then has a tape that goes around it just to give it that extra support. And then what we do with the aerial is we use a little bit of a little bit like cotton, and that goes around it, and we tie it securely then so that, your aerial's not, right, moving around, distracting the owl, and it's less chance the owl will chew it off as well.
And the actual size of the transmitter, is it 20-cent, 10-cent?
Probably around a 20-cent, but it's more rectangular. The guidelines are that it has to be less than 5% of the animal's body weight. So we're under that.
So that was going to be my next question. I mean, those button batteries, I guess, would be a good approximation of the size, that used to go in a watch.
It's really, I think the 20-cent piece is more on par with it.
And
it
about
is a little bit thicker.
Yeah, so maybe two 20-cent pieces stuck together would give an approximation of the weight.
Yeah, something along those lines. Okay. I can't remember the weight right off the top of my head, but we have really strict guidelines because, as you mentioned earlier, the last thing that we want to do is sort of, cause detriment to a species that we're trying to conserve.
And of course, if it's a huge irritant to the bird, it's going to spend all of its time worrying about getting rid of this big annoyance rather than maybe going and catching possums and feeding its kids. So, how long do you track an owl in how do you organise the study? Let's sort of talk about that process, because you mentioned that you are now helping people who have followed in your footsteps, so that's really useful science because you've got ongoing records from either the same bird or the same area. So can you sort of tell us what the studies you have been involved in have entailed? And hey, let's go the whole hog. What was the aim? What were you looking to find out in each one? And what have you found out that surprised you? Because that's always the most fun, isn't it?
So saying that, I've had people follow on from me, they're not actually my lab group. It's a lab group that works at Deakin. And basically I actually followed on from where my supervisor left off. So my supervisor had done a lot of work on the diet of powerful owls, and a little bit on sort of, the home range and that sort of stuff of powerful owls. And then I sort of picked up the ball and I ran with it. And my study was really about sort of what we think is driving powerful owls to move into these urban environments or more urbanized environments, even if we know sometimes that those environments aren't 100% catering for all of the resources that they actually need. So what my study found that as we move from sort of forested through to highly urbanized environment, the amount of potential habitat for these species reduces quite dramatically. So, in the forest, you can imagine that there's lots of trees, there's lots of structural diversity in the vegetation. So there's plenty of places for powerful owls to roost. There's prey there for the powerful owls. And because it's an undisturbed or relatively undisturbed environment, you also have the third thing that powerful owls need, which is really large hollows to be actually able to breed. So what happens is when we take a transition into sort of that urban fringe environment that I mentioned before, which sort of has bigger tracts of sort of relatively undisturbed bushland, but also that urban effect of houses and streets and cars and all of that sort of stuff, we get a sort of a shift in the resources that are available. So we've still got areas for these species to roost. We also have sort of, plentiful prey happening. And there's also still large hollows there for them, but not quite at the rate that they're available out in those, really forested environments.
Now, that's one of, sorry there, Bronwyn, but one of the interesting things about urban areas is that different suburbs have got different characteristics of the mature trees that are within them. So, and that can be a hangover from the director of horticulture or parks and gardens from 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago. Have you noticed anything about the distribution of owls in the suburbs in Melbourne and the predominant ornamental plantings that are present? Like, are they good at adapting to gardens?
That's a bit of a loaded question. So I'll just finish sort of that last transition. So if you go from urban fringe into sort of urban, basically what happens is we have plenty of areas to roost. So, you commonly find them roosting in parklands. There's been evidence of them roosting in smaller parks in sort of Melbourne. I think it was Footscray Park or Carlton Park. Also the Royal Botanical Gardens, close by the zoo, they've been seen roosting. There's plenty of prey, but the thing that's quite often lacking, not from all urban areas, because we still have urban parks that do have some older trees in them, but for the majority, we're missing those big hollows. But what we have noticed, group observations, is that they don't necessarily only roost in native trees. So they do use non-native trees for roosting. So we've seen them in pines. We've seen them in willows, very commonly in willows. At one of my urban sites, basically, they really loved the willow because it was right by the creek line, and they'd spend a lot of time in that willow. But then as soon as the willows lost their leaves, they no longer use the willow because it didn't afford them the protection.
Bronwyn, I'll just take this opportunity to say, if you don't mind, we've got people on all of the formats watching us at the moment. So
Hi.
if there's something that you particularly would like to know, and that I'm not doing my job and asking the right questions, put a comment in. I hope I'll see it, and we will put that to Bronwyn. The limiting factor for population growth seems to be the availability of hollows, and as you mentioned, that a natural forming hollow may take 100, 200, 300, 400 years to develop. How big is a usable hollow for nesting for a powerful owl, or for a pair of powerful owls, to be correct?
So we've got some rough estimates, but it's actually been shown more recently that they will use a smaller hollow if it fits their needs. But I'll just give you sort of those rough dimensions that we have in the literature. And that is sort of a metre deep hollow. We need an entrance of about 30 centimetres because remember, these are big birds. They've got to get in and out. And there needs to be enough room within that hollow to support the female while she's incubating eggs, and then the female when she's actually brooding up to 2 chicks.
And the incubation period is about how long? Like, a family has to move into a hollow for a period of a couple of months? How long are they in residence?
So I'll give you sort of the usual spiel. My timelines are slightly out because it's easier to remember it by 30 days or roughly a month to actually explain the process. What will happen is that basically around March, the male and female will come together. You'll find them sitting together a lot more. At night time, if you're out, you'll see them preening one another, nibbling on each other's toes. They do this cute little call, which I can't replicate, which is called a bleat. And as it sounds like, it really sounds like a lamb. So that's sort of around Marchish. By June, the female, well, sort of late May, early June, the female will enter the hollow and lay the eggs. From that point on, for at least 30 days, she's basically in that hollow all the time, incubating those eggs, except for at night time, which is when she comes out. She has a bit of a fly, and hopefully she has a very good mate, and he's bought her in dinner. She has a bit of dinner, then she heads back in and sits on the eggs again. After those sort of 30 days, what we then have is we have hatching, and she basically does the same thing as before. She stays in there, she broods her chicks for another sort of 30 days. And then for the last 30 days, she actually leaves the hollow. So they're in there by themselves. And basically, she'll only come in to feed them. And that sort of brings us, well, in Melbourne at least, that brings us to sort of, and it's really easy to remember because it's sort of grand final-ish time. So sort of late September, early October, we're heading out there to see the chicks actually fledge. And usually they have between 1 and 2 chicks.
And both of the parents sort of equal shares in going out and procuring food and feeding the fledglings, and at that period where the chicks are in the nest, is it the male doing most of the hunting, bringing food, or does the female go out for periods as well to feed the chicks? Is it an equal opportunity household?
Well, I've got 2 answers for you on that. And one is what the literature tells us, and one is what some of my observations have told us. The first one is that the literature says that during that time when the female is in the hollow and she's doing the brooding, the incubating and the brooding, the male will be catching food, and then when she comes out, the food's there for her. The second one, which I've observed a couple of times in urban environments, is that basically the female will come out and she'll head off and capture her own prey, and then she'll come back. She'll have some food, she'll then go back into the hollow. But it should be sort of a 50-50 split, but sometimes some mates are better than others.
And I guess some of them are more successful in their hunting techniques and whatnot. So there's always that. Do we know how big an urban territory is for a pair of owls? Actually, let me stack a couple of questions. Do we know how big the territories are, and then are they fiercely defended, and are they equally defended by the male and female of the pair? And here's the stacking: are urban territories similar to what we know happen in a forest, a natural setting?
So I'll start with forests, and hopefully I can remember all of those questions.
I can remind you.
Basically, I'll start with a forest. So there's been some sort of ad hoc surveys happen out in forests. As I've mentioned, this is a very cryptic owl. Sometimes they can be quite hard to catch. So basically, surveys out in the forest have said that they have much larger home ranges. So, we're talking sort of, 2,500 hectares and, up sometimes from there. So we think this is a function of that while there are a lot of different prey items out there in the forest, there's not as many of them on ground. So, the abundance of the prey is a little bit sort of lower. So they need those really big territories to suit all of their requirements. As we sort of move into urban areas, the reason we think that this species has moved into those urban areas is because there is more plentiful prey. So there's a higher abundance of prey, but there's a difference in sort of prey composition. So it's not quite as diverse as out in the forests. So once we move into sort of those highly urbanized environments, we have this shrinking happening in the home range. So, home ranges come down quite a lot. Off the top of my head, I think it's about 300 to 600, depending on the different qualities. But again, this is really recent information that we're working with. So it could be that we get more and more sites and we actually find that, some are much smaller. But again, it comes back to sort of that prey base.
And how
Fiercely
many
territorial.
Yeah. Are they are there so many owl pairs in the cities that there are now really vigorous battles for prime territory? Do we know what the population density is in those suitable habitats for powerful owls in Melbourne?
We actually don't have reliable, I guess you'd say, population estimates. The literature quite a while ago suggested that we've got about 500 pairs in Victoria. But, while we've actually done while the people that came after me did quite a bit of GPS tracking, we don't actually have estimates of the number of owls or even the number of pairs that we have across the urban environment. And I think that's probably one of the worrying things is that, we can work up an estimate, but we don't actually know.
Yeah. I was listening to somebody who was talking about urban owls in conversation once, and his view that was that we were doing so well with preserving mature trees and everything in Melbourne that it was creating a wonderful habitat for owls, and weren't we doing a good job? And then I said, hang on, maybe they're coming into the city because there's nowhere else suitable for them to live, that they have to adapt, and that the urban sprawl is removing them from other places, and that the city has far more mature trees than new suburbs. So this is the suitable place for them to live, and that it's not a mark of success or anything that we should be proud of. It's really an indicator of how adaptable the birds are, and it's a result of the fact that we're buggering up their habitat on the fringes of the cities. Discuss.
I really don't think it's that we're doing such a good job in retaining mature old trees. So you mentioned earlier, one of the problems in sort of these urban environments is that we have these sort of even stands. So everything is planted at the same time, it grows at the same rate, but then sort of when they get quite large, they're prone to losing limbs. We're talking about eucalypts here. They're prone to losing limbs. So basically they end up getting cut down because they're unsafe to the public. So I guess my view on what's happening is that these owls are being they're not being driven because they're still out there in the urban, they're still out there in the forest. They're actually being enticed into these urban environments because they basically are following the cues that have told them this is a good habitat out in the forest, but urbanization has actually changed the structure. So they've come into these urban environments because there is such a plentiful and a stable prey base. And then what happens is they're kind of stuck because while they've got the prey and while they've got areas for roosting during the day to actually shelter from any predators that could be around. They don't have those hollows to breed in. But I've actually been part of a project with some designers from Melbourne University, and they actually came up with a really cool idea where we could use not only science, but also design to actually come up with a solution to that problem of hollows, because we've tried putting boxes up in trees, like nest boxes. We've tried carved hollows. We've tried a whole realm of different things. But the problem with those sorts of things is that sometimes the target doesn't use them. It doesn't matter if you place them in exactly the right spot in a tree that you know the owl goes into. Sometimes they just don't use them. There was one success in Blackburn. Ed McNabb and his colleagues actually put up a box there for a pair of owls that were doing everything, and they were even laying eggs. The eggs were being released and smashing on the ground. So they actually put a nest box up, and it ignored it for like a year. It then used it, and they successfully fledged one chick. But as far as I know, it hasn't been used again. So the problem is, how do we get these animals to use these artificial structures? And the design team came up with this really cool idea of they would go out, they'd use computer-aided design. They can get the geometry and graphic dimensions of existing hollows that owls already use. They then go back into their lab, which is a little bit different than a science lab, but pretty cool from what I've seen. And they use 3D printing and augmented reality to actually assemble these structures. And so far from our pilot, it looks like these are a viable option and could produce conditions that are actually more like those natural hollows than, just whacking up what's the name of that, MDF type nest box.
And that can sweat. You want to know what's really cool? I spoke to someone about that, the 3D printed and the hempcrete stuff yesterday. So that discussion and your discussion are going to go out at the same time. So
was that Dan or Stanislav?
No, I actually spoke to Kylie. So
Kylie.
So hopefully Dan or Stanislav will be, in a discussion further down the line, because I'm really, really interested in all the different kinds of nest boxes or nesting opportunities that we can provide, because we often think of it with one species in mind, but there are so many different sizes of hollows that are required for birds, for all sorts of wildlife. And as you so adequately pointed out, that most of our horticultural plantings are of similar ages, so that we don't get the variety of hollows and things like just branch thickness and all those kind of things that animals need. Anything we can do, and using modern technology it's not so much the technology, it's the technique, and it's the thinking. The designers think in a totally different way than the people working with wildlife usually think. So it was a fascinating discussion. I was rapt that it was going to happen so close with yours, because we're getting all the same threads coming out. So let me ask you about how successful you think we are being across the board. Open space managers, cooperating with biologists and community groups, citizen scientists providing sites and collecting data. How well are we doing managing urban owl populations? And look, I know it's only new, and the efforts are only new, and we're not talking science here. We're giving opinion right at the moment, because it is all about thoughts of observations rather than having carefully considered and producing a paper. So I know I'm being a little bit unfair, hitting a scientist with something requiring opinion, but let's see. Are you going to jump into the ring?
I'm not sure I want to answer that question head on. But what I will say is the fact that, in my opinion, the more people that you can have on a problem, looking at it from all of those different angles, so, your land managers, your ecologists, your citizen scientists, the more likely you are to get more information. We are often bound in what we can do by the amount of funding that we get. When I was doing my PhD, I would go out and I'd do a lot of community talks, which, I really loved, because you'd have all these people coming into a space that were really passionate about their local environment and were, really impressed to know that the owls were there and wanted to know what new stuff we knew about owls. So when I was going out to these, I'd often get people come up to me at the end and they'd be talking to me about an owl that, they'd been watching, or, an owl they thought they'd been watching for 20 years. And, they'd taken notes on sort of the areas that they were using, the different trees they were using, whether they had chicks, whether they didn't have chicks, where they bred, all of this sort of information. And as I mentioned, we're often bound by dollars. So having other people out there, doing some of this legwork is amazing. And, when we can all come together and we can put these solutions into practice, it's a win in my book anytime.
Yeah, I think we're at that point where we're at that sort of, what do we call it? An inflection point. I love citizen science. I love citizen scientists. I think it's marvellous. But I really worry that the people allocating resources are saying, hey, you know how we don't give them enough now, but they're still producing results and they're still collecting data. How about we give them less? That I really worry about that, because citizen science should be augmenting the really well planned and structured research that is going on within the labs of all the universities at the moment, rather than being seen as a substitute for it. So I'll just put my oar in the water there.
Yeah, it's definitely can't be a substitute, because people might know when we plan sort of a project, we're following all the rules and the guidelines of systematic sampling, I guess you'd call it. Whereas a lot of the citizen science, and not all of it, I'm making a bit of a generalization here, some of that is very ad hoc. So it's really hard to then make comparisons over time. But when we have sort of scientists and citizen scientists coming together and working together to come up with the plan of how that project will run, and then working together to actually collect that data, and all of that sort of stuff, that's where sort of the really good information actually comes out of, because we're following all those protocols of science, but we have, a bigger body of people, or volunteers, I guess you'd call them, that are willing to go out there and do some of the legwork for us as well.
That's great, and I hope that there is more and more and more money allocated to these kind of work, and that then the citizen science projects can be further developed and be systematised so that the data can easily feed into other projects that are being planned out and undertaken by all of the different labs. And it's amazing how all of the universities have really moved forward in the last, especially the last 10 years, I think, in designing their projects and integrating with community. But there we go. Bronwyn, you talked about how big the territories need to be for a pair of powerful owls. I'm curious, do they tolerate the presence of other owl species in their territories? Will booboks coexist in a territory maintained by a pair of powerful owls?
Yep. So a lot of the territories of powerful owls actually have other owl species in there, and I know they're not owls; that they are frogmouths, but also tawny frogmouths also coexist in the same territories as well. I think basically they have different requirements. So a boobook, for example, requires a much smaller hollow. The diet is very different between a powerful owl and a boobook. And although they're both active at night, they can coexist in that space. They don't tend to coexist with another pair of powerful owls, and they're quite quick to sort of run their chicks out once it sort of rolls over into the next breeding season. I guess that's a bit of a side note. One of the things that I think is quite important that we actually don't know is that we actually don't know where those chicks go a lot of the time.
Well, that was going to be my next.
Survival.
That was really going to be my next question about that. If they're
Look at me preempting.
Well, if they're running their chicks out, there's one of two things happening. They're either surviving and establishing themselves in a new area and establishing a new territory, or they're dying. So, in the area, where have you really studied? Like, which geographical areas are being studied? And do we know if the population is stable or increasing or decreasing? That maybe give us a clue to what's happening with the youngsters.
So it actually doesn't. So basically, when they leave the territory, often we don't know what happens to them. A lot of the work that I've been involved with has been sort of along the Yarra, so Warrandyte, and in both directions from there. Basically, we know they leave the territory, and in most instances, we don't know where they go. There has been, I wasn't part of that study, but part of Ed McNabb's study is that blackburn bird, one of them, actually came from Listerfield. So it was born and banded in Listerfield, and then the next time that they saw it, it was actually in urban environments. So opinion-based here, we don't know, but we do know that a percentage would be surviving, and then a percentage maybe face mortality.
And I think, going from memory, I'm thinking that's about 15 k's, Listerfield into Blackburn.
You've just hit something that I'm very bad at, which is judging distances.
Listerfield's at the foot of the Dandenongs along the one of the rail lines, so it's not quite at the extremities of the of what we would call Melbourne, but it's a fair way out. I think it would be probably 15 k's. I would guess. I'll make an accurate view of it later and write it up in the show notes. But that means there could be a lot of owls. There could be an awful lot of powerful owls that are going along unnoticed in especially the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, where that sort of really leafy, dense cover is. But then you mentioned Footscray Gardens. That's
Fitzroy.
Fitzroy, sorry. Fitzroy would make much more sense. The maturity of the trees, certainly, and the cover, the density of the cover. Do you think the population in Melbourne is increasing, or are we just noticing owls more?
I think we're actually just noticing owls more, to be honest. I can't tell you either way whether they're decreasing, whether they're increasing, because, often people see an owl, and for example, that owl that I mentioned in the Fitzroy Gardens could be actually hopping between the various sort of parklands in urban Melbourne. We don't actually know if it's a different owl or if it's the same owl. So we don't always know. So it's really hard to sort of make an estimate of whether the population is increasing or decreasing. But powerful owls do garner a lot of attention. So I can't remember how many years ago it was now, but basically one showed up in urban Melbourne and was sitting in a tree in front of, I think it was a Dimmicks bookshop, and from memory it was Carlton. And basically people went nuts because they saw it. So I think people are actually looking out for them more, knowing that they occur in urban areas, and just stumbling across them as a happy accident.
Yeah, and look, if you do see an owl and a regular roosting haunt, please, if you're going to watch it from a distance, please, because I'm sure it would be annoying. Now, Bronwyn, how many? Well, are there still owls right at this moment that are being tracked, that have got tags and are being tracked? And
So
and in your group, how many individuals have been tagged and tracked that you've been collecting data on?
So yes, there's another PhD students that have actually started on with my old supervisors. So they're continuing the work that was started sort of with my supervisor, then me, and then Nick Bradsworth, and then on to Nick Carter. I've actually been a little bit distanced from the project, as you can imagine, in the last couple of years while we've been on lockdown. But I'm pretty sure it was about 17 individual owls that they were up to tracking at one stage.
Well,
And that's sort of the biggest tracking study on powerful owls, so far.
and that's pretty significant over the size of the territories and therefore the amount of Melbourne that is being covered. I think that must be fairly significant. So, be very interesting to see where that goes. What are you working on now, Bronwyn?
Well, as I mentioned right at the start, there's kind of three parts to who I am. The middle part of who I am is I am an educator at Monash University, and I've predominantly been teaching science, communication, and practice. And I'm now transitioning into very much a similar unit, but it's now called science, communication to influence change. So it's a bit of a big name there. So that's sort of the second part of me. And I really love sort of designing educational outcomes that students will get the most out of. So that's kind of where a lot of my focus these days go. The third part of me, it sounds like I've just split myself up.
Yeah, that's right. You're being sliced up.
The third part of me has actually really gotten interested into this whole science communication. So the ways that we as scientists can actually communicate with broader audiences. So far, I've been a bit limited because I've been very busy, but I've done a couple of radio interviews. I've written a couple of popular media pieces, which are basically converting my science, not dumbing it down, but converting it in a way that it actually then makes sense to sort of, the whole general public, basically. And I can say this is my first ever podcast. And so far I've had an absolute ball. So it would be nice to sort of do a little bit more of that as well. But yeah, a lot of my attention at the moment is building the unit that I'll be teaching come the end of February, doing some SciComm and, collaborating with that group over at Melbourne Uni that are sort of looking at design solutions to solve some of our problems.
Well, I'm available for SciComm anytime you like, Bronwyn. If there's something that you want to talk about that I can somehow jam into fitting it around bird conservation, always here to talk about it because we're at that stage where it's not only a battle for resources for people like yourself, all of the other people doing the analysis, collecting data, filling up their cars to drive to far-flung places to collect data. buying trackers. It never ends. Repairing mist nets. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. But you then need to speak to people outside of the outside of the group, and that's really all I'm trying to do is each time get one more person who might decide this is all pretty important stuff, and they might understand that seeing an owl in the city is fun and great and exciting, but it might actually be a symptom of a problem on the outskirts of town that we need to think a little bit harder about.
Yeah, definitely. I sort of, one of the things that I've learned through, my science, my teaching, all of that sort of stuff is, as I've mentioned before, when diverse groups come together and, they use science, they use design, or they use other disciplinary approaches, we end up with the best outcomes from it. I think sometimes we can get a little bit bogged down in very narrow thinking, and that tends to mean that we're not coming up with the best solutions. So, having these podcasts where you have scientists that come on and chat about what we do, and, just showing people what scientists do, because, there's that old age comic of, everyone thinks scientists hang around in labs or they hang around out in the bush doing something fun. A lot of our work is actually the admin and the finding the funds and all of that other stuff that goes along with it. So, yeah, it's really enjoyable. I'm not speaking for all scientists here because not all scientists like to talk about what they do, but we all should, and we should all learn sort of the backbone of how to communicate our work.
Now, Bronwyn, you are the first person that I've ever heard who has just mentioned applying for grants and quickly gone into it's really fun. I don't know anyone who thinks that writing up grant applications is a lot of fun.
No, we don't think that grant applications are a lot of fun. I've always been lucky to be in a team, and I haven't had to do a lot of the grant writing. But yeah, it's definitely not fun. And the number of projects that are put forward for those funds and the number of projects that are rejected, it's kind of heartbreaking, because all of those projects deserve funding, but a huge proportion of them don't get it. There's subsequent rounds where you could be lucky to get the funding, but yeah, I think we need to do a lot more in terms of conservation of our organisms. But how we get to that point, I don't have an answer for you.
No, it's a conundrum, and I don't think the wider public knows, and it's why I always bring it up. And I know often you guys are unwilling or uncomfortable to talk about it because it's sort of the dirty little secret, but that so much of the work that you do, even if there's a PhD grant, and as I was had it explained to me the other day, that it might be a 3-year, it's a period of 3 years, so it might be 21 grand, so it's $7,000 a year for a PhD candidate, and that might buy your tracking equipment and lease some time on a big computer to analyse some bioacoustic data or whatnot, and then you've got to pay for all your own petrol and running around and actually doing all the work. So people need to understand that a lot of the good science happens not because of the funding that governments provide or other foundations and whatnot, but often it's in spite of it. You scientists are actually putting a lot of your own funding. It's a lot of unpaid work that you're doing to provide the community with the information to make the decisions to protect our wildlife, our habitats, our environment that we all live in and that we all love. So there we go. I've said it. You don't have to, Bronwyn.
Yeah, but again, it would, in a sort of a perfect world, it would be great if there was no shortfalls, all of that sort of stuff. But there are some amazing, absolutely amazing scientists out there that are doing fantastic science, and you know, they don't have heaps of funds, but they've got enough funds to actually get the projects off the ground. But yeah, there is always those hidden expenses, and people are really expensive. That's one of the hidden sort of things in often in these projects that, you know, people don't think about. The logistics, you know, how many people you need, how long you need them for, all of that sort of stuff.
Are you wanting to do any follow-up work on the owls, or are you going to move into another direction with? I'm guessing you're going to do some more research apart from teaching comms.
Yeah, so basically the way that I'm employed is that I'm employed for my teaching, not for my research. So I'm a senior teaching fellow at Monash University in the Faculty of Science. But I do the research on the side because I love the research. I love the science. So as long as that continues to keep being feasible for me, in terms of, you know, keeping all of the balls that I'm throwing up in the air, then I'll continue to do that, because science was always my first love. But I also have these other parts of me that, you know, other things that I do that I really enjoy as well.
Being employed, forgive me for going off track, but this is
Is
something
great.
that really intrigues me about where universities and departments are having to go to sort of not stay relevant, but the world has changed in sort of the last 10, 15 years, certainly since I was a student at uni, and that comms is really important. How much decision making, or how much of a decision to support a project, give money to a project, might be influenced by the ability at the back end, at the completion, to actually go out and get publicity, to get on the TV, to won't be talking to me, because no one from comms departments ever want to put anyone on talking to me. But do you think that the positivity of the subject of the research, I think that's a clumsy way of saying it, but if there were two projects of equal value on every indicator, except one was a nice, beautiful, fluffy animal and one was a brown bird that no one's ever seen, would the fluffy, beautiful animal always win out because a minister might be able to cuddle it at the end and get in the paper?
I That's so far above my pay grade, how those sorts of decisions are made. So, but what we do know from conservation science is that, you know, it's much easier to get funding if you've got a cool, charismatic species versus if you are studying an earthworm, no matter how fascinating that earthworm is, which I think is incredibly wrong, because one of the things that we learn as conservation scientists as well is that everything is connected. So if you change one thing, that has ramifications all the way up to sort of those charismatic, beautiful top order predators. So, you know, I've always thought about it in terms of the system, how the different parts of the system fit together and how they all support one another. But yeah, you know, those big, charismatic, cuddly, cute looking things do tend to get more funding than, you know, others. But, you know, if it's really, really threatened or, you know, critically endangered, then a lot of money tends to get thrown at it in order to stop it from going extinct. So that's a very convoluted answer, but
no, it's one that we tackle frequently here. That I really struggle with it, with the amount of funding that is put in captive breeding. And don't anybody get me wrong, I'm not against it, but I struggle with the amount of money that goes into preserving stuff in cages, but not preserving the place where they live. So one day we want to let them out of the cages, and they got to have somewhere to go, and There's still a disconnect, not with the conservationists, not with the scientists, not with the people breeding the birds or the tortoise or whatever it is, but there's still a disconnect with the decision makers at the very top end. With, it's not good enough to save them. If you're going to save them, they got to have somewhere to go, and we still haven't crossed that bridge yet.
So I think one of the things that's really sort of disappointing or disillusioning when you work in conservation science, even when I was doing sort of my undergrad, was it's frustrating when you have that sort of disconnect happening. But again, the more people you can get having that conversation, if you can start talking to those policymakers, that communication can sort of aid those sorts of things. But, I'm just going to mention one off the top of my head, but there's a whole heap. Zoos, Victoria, they're doing fantastic work in sort of, breeding organisms so that we can re-release them out. But, ideally, in my mind, we shouldn't actually be waiting for a species to get to the point. If we had hypothetically, if we had all of the money at our fingertips, we should actually be starting with those common species. And we should be looking at how their numbers change over time, because then we'd get sort of a baseline about what is causing those changes. And then when they sort of got to the point where they needed help, we'd actually have a lot more information under our belt. A lot of sort of there's great people out there doing great work, but a lot of sort of conservation is very sort of reactive rather than proactive.
We talked about that yesterday a bit, in that the whole discussion about conservation is often framed with conflict in mind, and that we need to save things and that we need to have an enemy, the loggers, the developers, and geez, I'm guilty of it. Well, I'm guilty of it all the time. I'm always railing against anything that is cutting down the existing habitat. Thanks, Jen. I think Jen was agreeing with you and not me. I'm pretty sure about that. But the thing you mentioned is how frustrating it must be. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how we win, but I think we're making lots of inroads. But I just worry about whether it's going to be in enough time, and that we're probably just going to have to swallow the fact that we're going to lose many species, and we have to make sure that we limit the amount that we do lose. Don't know.
So I think one of the things that I learnt very early on when I was actually doing my undergraduate degree is that they're not all going to be wins. But to try and keep yourself a little bit sane, you've got to break it down into smaller parts and actually count some of those small wins, and sort of ride those coattails. I'm not saying that, we shouldn't aim for the bigger goals and that we shouldn't aim to achieve all those bigger goals. But I think sometimes you've got to take the small wins. And there's a lot of NGOs out there in Australia, with non-government organisations, that are doing absolutely fantastic work of sort of reclaiming land, putting it into conservation. So they're removing the pest species. They're putting up big sort of big fences to keep those pest species out, and then they're actually reintroducing animals that have previously sort of gone extinct here on the mainland, but have actually persisted out on those little islands. So there are people out there that are doing absolutely amazing work on shoestring budgets, but yeah, we can always do more. There's never enough money put into conservation.
Yeah, and they're leading the way in what can be achieved. But again, the frustrating thing is, and especially when you hear, again, I've got to say politicians, because they're the ones who are on the telly talking about this rubbish all the time, where they're talking about, oh, but, dollars, cost effectiveness. Well, how is it possibly cost effective where we're spending lots and lots of community dollars? It's often not taxpayer dollars, but it's coming out of community funds that have been raised to repair habitat, while at the other end of a species range, we're cutting existing habitat down. That makes no sense in an economic sense, but, it's inconvenient to look at it. But I love the work that Bush Heritage and all the different foundations are doing, and then the
Australian Conservation Foundation is doing some marvelous work.
Absolutely, and then there's the single species groups that are protecting, areas that are refuges for just one species, like the golden-shouldered parrot, and where private landholders are actually making the biggest impact in preserving species. So we're a long way down the track, but in one sense, but on the other hand, we're not getting anywhere.
I think the really cool thing that you said then, though, is that everybody can play a role. So the things that we do as individuals, the things that we do as small community groups, the things that we do as bigger groups, all of that has an influence. So, keep getting out there and doing your bits and pieces, whether it's, going to your local friends of group and pulling weeds or planting trees, or, just watching what's going on in the environment near you. Get involved.
Well, that's correct. It's, the sort of a catchphrase that's so daggy and dorky, but I like to say, you can't do everything, but for God's sake, just go and do something. And something might be going on a tree planting weekend with one of the local conservation groups or re-veg groups or something, or it might be getting involved in the surveys. If you live in Tasmania, get involved with Where We're Wedgie. If you, I was talking
to Clean Up Australia Day.
Exactly.
It's not glamorous, but it's very important.
That's right. And so actually, I'm old enough, Bronwyn. I can remember some absolute tip sites that were, little local pondages and whatnot, which were full of cars and shopping trolleys and tyres and stuff that people used as local dumps. And then Clean Up Australia Day came along, and now those places are wildlife refuges and havens for wildlife, because 20 or 30 people year after year chipped away a little bit, and now those places are priceless community assets in terms of biodiversity and having experiences with nature. So, yeah, I'm not always a grizzle guts.
I always like to, it's probably optimistic of me, but I always kind of like to be glass half full. So I know there's some terrible things happening out there. We have, animals going extinct, animals being poisoned, all sorts of different stuff is happening. But again, you've got a group or, a lot of really passionate people out there, kicking goals for conservation or, cleaning up our waterways or whatever they may be passionate about.
Now, you've reminded me there, Bronwyn, of one of the issues when it comes to predator animals and birds particularly, rodenticides and the potential effects on owls. Now, we cannot not talk about that.
I actually haven't been involved with that research. I did see it's from the group that I'm affiliated with. I wasn't involved in that research, but I did have a quick read, and, I actually heard before that research was conducted that it was possible in New South Wales that powerful owls were being poisoned by secondary generation rodenticides. And I was a bit like, I wanted more evidence first before I actually said, yes, that was happening. And I think we have very conclusive evidence that it's happening now.
If I had have thought that we were going to talk about this, I've got a pile of photos of the evidence of the dead birds on the ground. So I would have teed that up. Bronwyn, let me just for a moment do this. If you want to hide from a bit of politics speak, feel free to do that. But hello, Board of Bunnings. You are the largest supplier of hardware items and garden products in the country. Please, please, please remove your second generation rodenticides from your shelves and give all of the wildlife a chance. The mice will still be dead, and the owls and the galahs and the pigeons, etc., won't be. Thank you. Here ends the lesson.
I think one of the biggest problems is that people don't understand how these sorts of things move through the food chain. So, it's not that an owl has to eat a rat that's been poisoned. Something else can eat that rat, and then the owl can eat that thing, and it's still making its way through the food chain.
And it's not always that animal. It's, as we saw with treated seed being used. It could be sparrows and pigeons and parrots who are then eaten by something that are then eaten by eventually an owl or a goshawk or whatever. So there are alternative products that are far less bad, and that's the point. We're not saying don't have pesticides. No, we're not saying that. Okay, you have a choice. You have the opportunity to still fulfill the need in the marketplace. If we're going to talk about economics and we're going to talk about consumer behaviour and everything, just provide in the most prominent position at the best price the safest possible option, or else consumers might start getting militancy. Because there's a lot of us annoyed. That's all I want to say. And the frustrating thing is, I'm
very glad that a lot of people actually are annoyed, because it means that they care about the impact that they're actually potentially having on the nature around them. Because I think a common misnomer, which some people fall into the trap of, is that nature doesn't happen around them. Nature happens somewhere else, sort of thing. But, for some species, people's backyards are really, really important because they provide the stepping stones into other areas. So, everything that we do, we have to think about the potential impact that we're having.
Sorry, got a bit real again, but
there's nothing wrong with getting passionate about things. But I'm sure if you have a chat to Nick Carter, who was part of that research team, he'd be more than happy to come and have a chat with you.
Well, Nick, you're on notice. There'll be something in your inbox.
I've just thrown you into it.
That's right. There'll be something in your inbox before you know about it. Well, look, I've got. I'll promote it beginning on the 28th of February. Every fortnight, Holly Parsons from BirdLife, Birds in Backyards, is back with me on the birdie style Monday megaphone. So we're back every 2 weeks talking bird issues, and we will no doubt be talking about rodenticides often. On the first one, actually, Bronwyn, you might be interested in this. John Martin is joining Holly and I to talk about urban birds, particularly cockatoos, brush turkeys, bin chickens. And not only are we going to talk about John's work with wing tags and so many other things. John's been involved in so much work in Sydney, but I'm also bringing in a cockatoo behavioural specialist who is a great admirer of John's work, but she's working on cockatoos from London. So yeah, if you're into cockies and you're into bin chickens and birds in the city, don't miss that. What do we got? 1 p.m, 28th of February on Monday. That's Melbourne and Sydney time. So
just to bring it back to powerful owls apparently also eat brush turkeys, which is very interesting because brush turkeys are really big.
Well, Bronwyn, who's notice that? Like, is that a sort of coincidental citizen science observation, or has someone been studying it and got some really hard data on that?
I'm actually not sure. A lot of those sort of observations come about because somebody saw it holding it as prey. But yeah, as I said, way back at the start, we thought, just possums and gliders. Then we sort of knew that they were taking birds, and then they're taking flying foxes. So, I would never say never with a powerful owl anymore.
As long
There's
as
surprising things that pop up in their diet.
as long as it didn't come about sitting around a campsite saying, "Oh yeah, mate, one day I saw one getting off with a scrub turkey."
No, there was actually photographic evidence of the powerful owl holding a scrub turkey. So
Well,
yeah.
well, nothing about a powerful owl would surprise me because I've only had 2 encounters with them up close. I'd seen them in the bush through binoculars a long way away, but it's not until you're within 15, 20 metres of one that you actually realise how big they are. And I mean, if they were nasty, they would be terrifying,
I'll never forget. Logically, how big a wedge-tailed eagle is. You see them soaring up in the sky, but one day I actually saw one sitting on a carcass, and it was sitting on a carcass of a kangaroo, and it did that sort of classic posture of, this is my prey, don't come close. And its wingtips were out to either end of the kangaroo. So yeah, it isn't until you sort of logically know how big they are, but once you get close, and we've had these owls in the hand, and they're absolutely magnificent creatures. So the size of the talons on this owl are just absolutely ridiculous.
That's what I was just gonna mention. Imagine a talon going into your wrist. I mean, they are what? Where's the camera? Here we are. They're about that. They're that long, and they nicely curved. They're weapons of mass destruction, I would say.
Yeah, we always tell people, if you find a raptor that has been injured, always be careful about the talons, because while the beak will give you a nasty bite, the talons are really what do the damage.
Yeah, it's I certainly wouldn't be trying to handle any of these kind of birds without something like a blanket or a ground sheet or something like that, where you could wrap them up, both for their safety and for yours. Look, that extends to cockatoos and things like that.
Wow! I picked up an injured cockatoo one day because I didn't have anything, and my hands took forever to recover. So
me too.
Yeah, and people may not know how destructive they are, but their parrots are super destructive.
Yeah, and I got a nasty infection too from that bite. So, yeah, just be careful. Be careful. Bronwyn, I think we've. Is there anything else we haven't covered with owls? Because I want to run you through the bird emergency questions, our standard questions for our guest. Yeah, that's right. You've got to look terrified.
It sounds like a bit of a quiz, and I haven't done any preparation.
Oh, you can't do preparation for the bird emergency questions. You either know the answers or you don't.
Do I get a 50-50 phone a friend?
Oh, we're pretty lenient, but it's actually let's get the important stuff out of the way. If somebody wants to be involved in any of the owl projects that are going on that you know about, what's the best way? Obviously, you know about what's going on at Monash, but do all of the science labs, the zoology labs, have projects that people can get involved in? Is there a central place where people can register their details? What's the best way for someone to chase down a project to be involved in?
I don't know if there's a central place that you can actually contact people on where a list of all the projects are, but research labs definitely have a list of the projects and the people that are working on different things. So if you were really interested in getting involved, you could send them an email and, you know, get in contact. And if they've got a place to have people come out and volunteer, then, you know, we do rely on people actually helping us out for free. So we are looking for those volunteers. But, you know, if you're interested in owls, you could shoot me an email at Monash and I can put you in touch with people that are out in the field doing that work, or you can just do a bit of a Google search about, you know, who's working on what.
And actually, I'll put my hand up too. If I often hear and know about people who are working in certain fields, so you can always find me on Twitter at Bird Emergency, not the Bird Emergency, on Twitter at Bird Emergency, and I can generally hook you up with somebody who will be able to know an answer to any kind of question. And hey, that applies all around the world. There's people working on owls and doing all sorts of great citizen science projects all around the world. So if you're not sitting in Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane or Adelaide or Hobart or Perth or Darwin or Bathurst or wherever in Australia, if you're in London, you know, there's urban critters everywhere, and there are citizen scientists in the wildest places in the world. I've been watching some great stuff in Uganda that's been happening. It's happening everywhere. So, yeah, if you want to be involved, just get off your chair, turn off YouTube, and go and be involved. All right, Bronwyn, are you ready?
Hit me.
Okay, when you're out in the field and you're looking at birds, what's your field guide of choice?
My field guide of choice. That's a bit of a hard one because
I know.
I am apparently termed an ornithologist, but I actually don't like being termed an ornithologist because generally when I go out in the field, I'm only looking for specific things. So I guess I don't really use a field guide all that much. But it would have been one of the bird field guides.
Well, there we go. I'm glad. Look, that gives me a lot of confidence in you as a scientist, Bronwyn, that when you're out looking for birds, you would be using a bird field guide. I'm very happy with that. I'm very comforted by that answer. All right. Well, I think we've established that you're not really a birder. And
I feel guilty when people call me a birder because I very much know the species that I'm interested in working on. A lot of the common birds that you get in your gardens, I know those as well. When I actually go for a walk with the dog, there's some beautiful little superb fairy wrens in the little sort of remnant vegetation down near me. So, you know, I know the ones that are familiar, but I'm not one of those twitchers that are running around trying to put a list together of birds.
Well, because it's my show and I'm allowed to, I'm going to modify the bird emergency questions a little bit for you because. So let's talk about if there was one place in the world that you could go to be at one with nature, you know, just go wildlife watching. Where would you go?
Oh, one place. I'm really glad I had one.
There's only one ticket left, and it will take you anywhere you want to go, but you must choose a destination.
Well, I'm not going to pick Australia, even though Australia has amazing things, because I can jump in my car anytime. I would actually pick Tucson, Arizona. I was lucky enough to go over to a raptor conference in Tucson, Arizona. The conference wasn't there. I did a sort of furlough while I was over there. And I guess Tucson, because it's such a different landscape. I know we have desert landscapes here, semi-arid landscapes, a lot of it actually, but it's just so different. The rocky terrain, these big, gorgeous, they're called saguaros, and I probably just mangled that pronunciation. And everything over there, no matter whether it looks like you can touch it or not, it generally has thorns, so you shouldn't touch it. I learned that the hard way when I touched, I think it's called an ocotillo bush, and the thorns actually sit directly under the leaves, so you can't see them. You just grab hold of
Oh,
it and go,
oh
oh!
no, under your
Yeah.
fingernails. Oh
But
no.
I saw some of, oh no. I should have picked somewhere else as well. Because
Well,
I also,
all right, you can have a do-over.
the second place that I would pick is Cape May in New Jersey. It sounds like a really odd choice, but again, I went to a raptor conference there, and basically they have this area which is sort of like a wooden deck kind of thing. And at certain times of the year, you can walk out into that wooden deck and you can just see raptors galore. So any raptor in that area which is migrating through, because they have these specific migration patterns, you can stand out there and watch. I saw bald eagles and lost my mind. I saw sharp-shinned hawks, Cooper's hawks, ospreys. Oh, it was, and they're going through by the thousands. So, I
Okay,
am a
so
bit of a bird nerd. I'm
no, no,
just a specialist bird
yeah,
nerd.
you're a raptor nerd. That's what you are.
Yes.
So, does that mean that you've travelled to see the red goshawk? Because that seems to be the one everyone wants to see, or the grey falcon, the other mystery bird for raptor heads.
No, I actually haven't seen either of those. I'm a see things by coincidence kind of girl. I just go out, but then I get really excited also about sort of, other raptors that people don't get excited about. So, it's just gone out of my mind.
Well,
Nankeen kestrels, for
I
example,
love
that are
Nanking kestrels.
doing their hover, or black-shouldered kite. Is it black-shouldered kites? The
Yeah,
common,
black-shouldered kites. They're
yeah, that are
sitting there.
doing their little bit of a hover thing happening.
And
Those sorts of occurrences also get me really excited. So I guess I'm just a little bit weird.
no, 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 not at all. You're a genuine raptor head. I mean, watching black-shouldered kites is amazing, and if you can get close enough and see what they actually drop down on and what they're eating, that's fascinating. Because grasshoppers are pretty big for them. So yeah, amazing. What's your? Well, let's make it easy for you. What's the raptor? What's the raptor that is on your bucket list? What is the raptor that you just wish you could see?
I actually have two, and again, neither of them are Australian raptors. I'm a very bad Australian today. So my two bucket lists are great grey owls, which are one of the tallest owls in the world and absolutely spectacular. So back to sort of the Northern Hemisphere to see those. And my second one is also kind of a weird owl. It's called the burrowing owl.
Yep.
And basically, it's very different from a lot of other owl species because it actually breeds and lives in burrows underground dug by other mammal
And
species.
I think sort of they roost in outside of the breeding season. I think they roost in like a family group, not solo. So they roost in the burrows as a group, and then they nest in a different burrow as a pair. That's I think that's how it is. I'm
I don't know
probably
the
wrong.
exact specifics, but I guess I like them so much because they are weird in that they breed and live in these burrows, and secondly because they're quite diurnal as well. So most owls are nocturnal or crepuscular, most active dawn and dusk, but these owls are diurnal, so they're awake during the day. Actually, I have a third one as well, which I've only just recently learned about in the last 5 years, and it's called the elf owl. And it is absolutely tiny, but it catches these giant centipede-like organisms and brings them back, and it actually has hollows in those saguaro cacti. So,
Ah,
I've got three sort of bucket list species.
okay. So that's one of the ones that makes a hollow in the
In the
cactus, or
cacti.
or it takes over one of the hollows that the woodpecker that makes the
Yes.
holes in the cactus
Yeah.
takes over. I think that's how that succession goes, doesn't it?
And while I am a bit of a raptor nerd, I did lose my mind when I was in the States when I saw a woodpecker. And apparently it was a very common woodpecker, and I shouldn't have got so excited. But when I actually started talking to the person there, they couldn't believe that we don't have something like the woodpecker.
Yeah, we don't have anything.
It actually
like
makes hollows over here. And it was very much the same with squirrels. I was so excited I'm still so excited over squirrels. But when I actually started talking to someone and saying, we don't have squirrels like what you've got here, we have arboreal possums. And they're like, oh, you've got opossums. And I'm like, no,
we don't have ugly possums. We've got super cool possums.
So yeah, it's always nice to go and visit a place and see how things are different than where you come from.
Yeah, look, the world's amazing, isn't it? I mean, there's so much to see. Hopefully, we can see as much of it as we can before it disappears. I was recently talking to David Tan, who's from Singapore, but he's doing his PhD at the University of New Mexico, and he made the point that that part of the US is at the conjuncture of a bunch of different habitats, and that little corner where he lives, you can see so many different types of birds that it's one of the most exciting places that he's ever been out birding for pleasure and then accompanying other people on field work. So
he might also be in a migration zone as well. Where,
he is. Yeah.
Getting my head around being in Australia and getting my head around the fact, the first time I visited, I was like, so what raptors can you show me? And they were like, a lot of them have actually, flown south already. And I'm like, oh, I forgot about that whole long distance migration thing.
That's right. Fly south for the winter. Yeah. Well, Bronwyn, I think we've adapted the bird emergency questions enough for you because we've established that you are not at the extreme end of the bird nerd spectrum where you are insanely chasing rare species and maintaining your life list. I'm guessing you have no idea about your life number. There we go.
No. I'd like to preface this in just saying I think I would be a nature nerd. So there's so many things about nature that fascinate me. I'll go for a walk and I'll look at something and I'll be thinking, how does that work? And then I'll go back and I'll do a bit of, research, learning about different things. I guess I'm just passionate about a lot of different things.
Yeah. I mean, we all view the world from our own prism, and as someone who is a plant nerd and a bird nerd, I don't think you can be either without being a nature nerd. I mean, you can't not go, oh wow, never seen that lizard before. What is it? And then to come back and get into all the field guides and nut it out for yourself, and if not, take the photo and let the internet sort it out for you. So
I'm very much one of those people that need to take a photo. I particularly raptors, I find that they're underneath their wings are quite elaborate, the patterning. So if I want to, if I see a raptor that I've never seen before, I have to take a photo because by the time I get back to my field guide, I've actually forgotten what that patterning actually looked like. So yeah. Yeah, it's great that we've got cameras at our fingertips these days.
I know, but the lost art of the field sketch, though. Were you ever that little kid? Did you have a little sketchbook and go out and sketch things in the bush?
No, but I actually still have copies of, I think it was first year plant science, where we had to do scientific drawings of different plants. Yeah. And I may even have sort of a press.
Have you got your pressings? Yes.
A book somewhere with weeds.
Yeah.
Because one of the units that I did as part of my undergrad was we had to collect the weeds.
Yeah, you had to
And
go and
that was
find
awesome.
20 weeds in your location, and then, that was the same for horticulture and making the pressings, having the
And
plant
I
press,
can still go
hanging it
out
up,
now.
yeah,
I can still go out now and I'll
and
be like,
identify
oh,
them.
that's a that, that's a that.
Yeah,
So I think it's important that we still do those sorts of things, because it's a really good way to learn.
yeah. The lessons stay with you. Bronwyn, before we wrap up, we've got some eyeballs on us live at the moment, so I might just take the opportunity for them, the Twitchers, the Facebookers, and the YouTubers. If there's a question that you would like to ask about owls or about citizen science in general, you have an opportunity now to type it into the comments, and I will see it, and I will put it to Bronwyn. Oh, and that's always the most entertaining part of any conversation, is when you're waiting for someone who's not in it to say something. So there we go.
It's very much like that in education as well. I think you
Yeah,
just have to sit in the silence and just enjoy the silence.
that's right. What is it on Ferris Bueller's Day Off? Bueller. Just waiting for an answer. No, we're not getting any. Okay, Bronwyn, thanks for being part of the bird emergency. I'll hit you up at some stage where maybe we can get you on a Megaphone Monday, and maybe with Kylie and some of the nest space people, the design people, and we'll maybe talk about some of the issues again about hollows, and maybe we'll get some horticulture open space manager people in too, and talk about the processes that they have to go to when they're thinking about how to assist wildlife while at the same time managing a maintenance budget, because all of these things are what drive all of the decisions that are taken.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Bronwyn. Now, can people follow you on the socials or anything? Are you putting info out there for people to engage with?
I do a little bit. I'm a bad scientist in that respect. I'm not very active on Twitter. I do scroll through, and if I see something, I comment on it. But I'm not putting a lot of content out there. But I'm always happy for people to contact me and have a chat on social media. Yeah.
What do you prefer? What are the socials that you use?
I mostly use Twitter, so
Okay.
I'm at Raptor Ecologist.
At
If you
Raptor
would like to
Ecologist.
connect.
And if you forget that and you can't find Bronwyn, you can find me at Bird Emergency, and I'll make sure you can find Bronwyn. So, great. Thank you. Thanks everyone
Thank you for having me.
thanks for being involved. Bronwyn, it was a pleasure to meet you. It's always fun talking about owls, because there we are. Here we go. You can read this one out. It's from Jan. Can you
Hi,
see that
Jen.
one?
Thank you so much. That was a lovely thank you. Very enjoyable. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It was my very first podcast. I was a little bit nervous, but it was a lot of fun.
Oh, it's super scary talking to me because it's such a challenging interview. I can tell you that.
No,
it's,
I think it's more just doing something that you've never actually done before. So, but
well,
it was wonderful.
well, you're good talent, Bronwyn. So I'm sure there'll be lots of other podcast producers and hosts who are looking you up before you know it, and you'll be talking owls until you have a very sore throat and a tired brain. So.
Sounds like a good time to me.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. I'm Grant Williams. That's been Dr. Bronwyn Isaac from Monash University. This has been the Bird Emergency. Thanks. See you next time.